special to do with the cars that we all love. We on the board have looked at the log as a total immersion in Lotus, 3 days or 4 days of everything you could want to do. And one of the things we've always felt is important is to continue to have the folks who have made it possible for us to be here and to enjoy the cars that we do. We are very fortunate this year to have a person who follows in the footsteps of a lot of those other folks. Peter Warr spent a good portion of his life, certainly almost all of his working life, involved in Lotus in one manner or another. He dealt with a lot of the personalities that we have come to appreciate. He was associated with Lotus in various forms from about the time of the 7 through the 101 with a short respite someplace else. And he is here tonight, has graciously spent his time this weekend enjoying talking with lots of folks, and I'm sure everybody that's had the opportunity to speak with Peter has enjoyed the time they spent with him. So Peter, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Austin. Madam Chairperson, ladies and gentlemen, and I suppose I ought to also call you loggers, good evening. Graham Hill was in the habit of starting a speech by saying, "This is the second time today I've got up from a warm seat with a piece of paper in my hand." But I'd like to tell you about a swallow. And this particular swallow was so happy with life that he left his migration south very, very late. And when he finally decided to set out, the air was so cold that his wings froze. And he crashed to earth in a field. And as he lay there, a cow happened along and lifted its tail right over where this poor swallow was. And there he was. Now the warmth of the cowpat thawed him out. And after a while, he was comfortable again, and he went cheep, cheep, or whatever swallows do. And a cat that was passing heard this noise, scratched away in the cowpat, found the swallow and ate him. Now there are 3 morals in this story, and that is that not everyone who drops you in the shit is your enemy. And not everyone who gets you out of the shit is your friend. So if you're warm and happy and in the shit, keep your mouth shut. Now I'm warm and I'm happy, and I'd like to keep my mouth shut. But Foster has gone to a lot of trouble and invited me over, and obviously I'm obliged to speak. I suppose in front of this select gathering, I should be talking about Lotus. But I'm sure, and even more sure after today, that collectively you probably know a great deal more about that subject than I do. My expertise, such as it is, lies in Formula One Grand Prix racing. And I thought you might welcome a change from the perennial problems of restoration. Where do I get those spares I need from? Why doesn't the factory answer my letters? How do I get my chassis number authenticated? Why does my glass fiber and paint blister in the hot sunshine? In any case, apart from a season as chief steward of the Formula One World Championship in '92, I stopped racing at Team Lotus in 1989. Now, I know they were sorry to see me go, because as a leaving present, they offered me a dinner with John DeLorean at any open-air restaurant in Belfast. So, I'm not entirely up to date in Formula One matters, and so what do I talk about? Well, don't worry, it's certainly not going to be a lecture on race car development or the performance advantage of active suspension over ground effect aerodynamics. And having been racing for over 30 years, and having run a Formula One team for over 20 years, I can assure you that that subject is far too large to cover in 30 to 40 minutes. But I have been lucky enough during my working life to have worked with 12 world champion drivers. And I thought, therefore, you might be interested to have some rambling asides, reminiscences, and personal observations about some of these drivers. I stress, particularly as millions of words have been written about them, that these are personal views. And bearing in mind that tonight I'm speaking primarily to an American audience, I've picked out some that have a relevance and a meaning to both Lotus enthusiasts and the US racing scene. So, if I could, I'd like to start with Jim Clark. Now, I'm sure you all know that this was an extremely quietly spoken sheep farmer from Berwickshire in the border country of Scotland. But for all that, he had a marvelous personality. He was quiet and shy, and yet he had all the ingredients of a tremendous racing driver. And his personality was such that the public warmed to him wherever he went. You get some race drivers, like I suppose you get some sportsmen in all sports, whom the public either love or they hate. I think in Formula One, Jackie Stewart and James Hunt fell into that category. People either loved them or hated them. But I never met anybody who didn't love Jim Clark. And this was the effect he had on people when they met him. I'm sure, like the case of JFK, everybody can remember what they were doing when they heard the news about his accident. And the stories, of course, about him are absolutely legion. I once asked him how it came to be that at 5 minutes to go before the end of a Formula One practice session, he had this uncanny knack of going out and just popping in that last little quick one, which was out of reach of everybody else, and putting himself on the pole position as he did so many times in his career. And he answered by saying, well, I don't know. So I said, well, you must know. I mean, do you use more revs? Do you squeal the tires? Do you use extra bit of the road? What do you... He said, well, no, actually, now I come to think about it, he said, I do everything absolutely the same, but all I do is just brake a little less gently for the corners. And there was a sign of somebody who had such confidence that going into a corner at a speed which he hadn't tried before, he still came out the other side of it and did it quicker than anybody else. At Indianapolis in 1966, where they have this rather strange qualifying ritual of 4 laps, and you put your hand up if you're ready to go, and you get the green flag and you run your 4-timed laps. It was in the era where we, from Europe, were just learning about seatbelts. And he committed himself to his qualifying, and if he didn't take it, he has to go to the back of the queue. And the seatbelt came undone. And even in those days, the G-loads in the corners at Indianapolis were so high that he was getting lifted out of the cockpit in the corners. But being Jimmy, he didn't abort the attempt. He went on and put it on the front row of the grid. I remember also at Brands Hatch, quite early on, I think 1959, he was invited down to share in a test of a Formula 2 car. And I remember there was something like 4 firsts about this occasion. It was the first time he'd driven a single-seater. It was the first time he'd driven a Formula 2 car. It was the first time he'd driven at Brands Hatch. And I think I'm right in saying it was the first time he'd driven a Lotus even. Perhaps not. Anyway, he went out and within 5 laps he was quicker than anybody else on the day. And I think that early indication gave us due notice that we were dealing with something very, very special. To follow that up, later on, he was invited by Patrick Lindsay, who owned a very famous pre-war ERA, which had been driven by Prince Bara. And he was invited by him to do a few laps in the middle of a demonstration at Rouen in France, which is a pretty daunting circuit. And again, it was the first time he'd ever driven a supercharged car. It was the first time he'd driven a pre-war racing car. It was the first time he'd driven a car with the accelerator pedal in the middle. And in 3 laps, he was quicker than the owner. And I think all this came out of an ability that is beyond the comprehension of mere mortals like ourselves. But the thing that made him the champion that he was, as all of them have, this inherent competitiveness, where they have to be the best at everything they do. And one night, when the factory was at Cheshunt, Colin and Hazel Chapman gave a party, and as parties were in those days, when we were younger, it was a fairly riotous affair. And fairly late on in the evening, somebody produced a pogo stick. And in no time at all, there was a fairly serious competition with some heavyweight money being betted on who could get up Hazel Chapman's stairs first on the pogo stick. Well, needless to say, Hazel, who was exceptionally house-proud, was not impressed by the attempts of some of us who managed to get onto the first or second step and knocked a couple of her wall lights off in the process. And needless to say, Jimmy went up not only to the first bend in the stairs, but around and clear to the top without falling off. And this was enough to make us all pretty upset. So we dived out in the garage or wherever the kids' toys were kept, and we found, I don't know what you call them, but we call them a woggle board, which is basically a log with a plank on top. And you have to balance. And again, the money came out of the pocket, and it was bets on how long you could stay on it, and people were falling around on the floor, and there was much hilarity. And when Jimmy Clark had been on it for a minute, he asked someone to pass him his drink. He had a Lotus Elan, and as you probably know, it now belongs to Jabby Cromback, who was with you, I think, last year. And Jabby keeps the car in Paris. So when he had that Elan, he set a record in the days before freeways existed, from London all the way to his home in Scotland, of 4.5 hours, which is an average of about 88 miles an hour. And quite recently, and when I say quite recently, like within the last 18 months, I did the same trip in a 500 SE Mercedes with the freeways in place all the way, and it took me 6.5 hours. When he went to live in Paris, because of his tax situation, the Elan went to Paris and he bought a Porsche 911 because it was the car to have at the time. And he set off, and he was determined that he was going to beat his 4.5-hour record from the factory in Cheshunt to his home at Duns. And I can't remember exactly how long it was after he left, but something like 3.5 hours after he left, the phone went, and it was him saying he'd had a bit of a problem. And we asked him why, and he said, well, you won't know it, but there's this particularly nasty Y fork in the road, he said, and I don't know what came over me, but I thought I had to go left or right, and in the end I did neither and went straight up the middle. And so his Porsche 911 was altered to the short wheelbase model in fairly short order. He was probably the greatest racing driver of all time. It was wonderful that he and Colin were together and that he drove Lotuses. But he was such a modest guy that you really couldn't get upset or in any way offended by somebody who came into the pits once and he said, why don't the others go as fast as me? And that really summed him up, because I think he didn't really know where it came from, but it was a God-given gift. Graham Hill, another name with which I'm sure you're all familiar. I can't omit Graham. He was a wonderful character, gritty, tough, courageous, self-taught, but exactly the opposite of Jimmy, because God didn't give him this talent. He had to work hard at it to develop it. And you might say, well, what's the American connection with Graham Hill? Well, of course, he won Indianapolis, but that was in a Lola, which is cheating a bit. But I thought I'd tell you the story anyway, because that was the year that we thought we'd won. And we used to have a guy called Cyril Aubrey, who used to come along and do our lap charting at Indianapolis, which in those days was normally far superior to the system they employed at the circuit. And the two cars were going around Indianapolis towards the end of the race, separated by half a lap. And Cyril Aubrey had our man, Jimmy, as the half lap in front leader. And the organisers had Graham as the half lap in front leader. So when Jimmy drove into Victory Lane, you know, across the black and white checkered thing, Graham was already in there, in the Lola. And this is a bit of a surprise. Well, Jimmy was a fairly laid-back sort of fellow. So he got out of the car and sauntered over to Graham, and he said, what are you doing here? And Graham said, well, I've won. So Jimmy said, well, no, they told me I won. And Graham said, well, no, I'm sorry, I know I've won because I've drunk the milk. As a race driver, he was a terrible fiddler, though, and a very hard man to get on with. He loved nothing better than to come into the pits, one lap up, half a turn here, half an inch down there, change this a little bit, change that a little bit. He drove us all mad. And he was the one who was almost single-handedly responsible for introducing us to the joys and pleasures of Hewland gearboxes, something which made Mike Hewland a multimillionaire because they were so dreadfully unreliable. He had to have a gear that would be just right for this straight, and he'd come in and he'd change them by half a tooth at a time sometimes. Absolutely awful in terms of the amount of work he generated in the pits. But he will be remembered absolutely without doubt by everyone connected with Lotus for his absolutely unbelievable behavior and courage and determination, and the lead he set in 1968 after Jimmy's accident, when single-handedly he got the whole outfit through to the end of the season and won the championship for us. But a lot of people remember him for his funny side. And while we're talking about Indianapolis, some of you will have seen around today, I've seen some pictures of the the turbine car, that funny wedge-shaped car with a Pratt & Whitney engine in the back. And it was a very unconventional car and very different at the time. And I had to ring Graham up and say, because Jimmy was away in Paris, couldn't come back to England, I had to ring Graham up and say, will he come up to the factory for a trial fitting in the cockpit? And the monocoque was sitting in the shop on some trestles, and he came in and he looked at it and he said, that looks all right. He climbed into it, stretched himself out, and he said, my God, for the first time, you made a car with plenty of room in it. And we had to tell him he was sitting in the engine bay and not in the cockpit. Funerals have been in our mind a bit in England lately, and I think the one before that, which was the most moving one I've been to, was Graham's in St. Albans Cathedral. And it was a frightful experience, seeing his coffin being borne in with just his helmet and nothing else on it. And it's such a great pleasure to see that helmet out and about again in the shape of his son Damon, and not only out and about, but winning championships and making his father very proud of him. Now, Graham also enjoyed a game of cricket, and that's a game which I won't attempt to try and explain to you, except to say it's a bit like baseball. It's played with a bat and a hard ball, and there are innings and runs and things. But unlike baseball, which is normally played in a stadium, much of cricket in England is played on a village green. And nearly always by a village green you have a pub. And I'm reminded of the time once when Graham, in obvious pain, staggered into the pub on the edge of the village green with his hands clasped between his legs. And the barmaid said to him, what's happened to you then? You've been hit by a cricket ball? And Graham groaned, yes. So she suggested that he lie on the bar, and she'd give him a bit of a massage and help him get back on the field. Well, after a few minutes of massaging his groin, she asked him, is that any better? And he said, yeah, it's a lot better, thanks, but I think the fingernail will still go black. Jochen Rindt's my next champion, and of course he was another Lotus World Champion. And the first time I ever saw him was at a funny little circuit in northern Italy called Cesenatico, where he was driving a Formula Junior Cooper. And he seemed to have discovered that the way to get round this place was to bounce the car off the straw bales, because that sort of kept it in play. And somebody who was with me, and he had no real motor racing connection in the sense of working in it or anything, but who must have been quite an astute observer, said, you know, if that guy doesn't kill himself, I think he's going to be world champion. And he went on, and he was eventually. He was very fast, very cool, but he was a complex man with a very strange physical makeup, and some of you know the books and the pictures and the race reports very well. Notice that he never seems to have a consistent race helmet on. Sometimes it's full face, sometimes it's open face, sometimes it's this colour, sometimes it's that colour. And that was because he was very often sick in the car, physically sick in the car, which seems to be quite strange for somebody who is a good enough race driver to become world champion. He was always going to retire when he became champion, and of course the tragedy of it was that he became a posthumous world champion after his accident at Monza. And just to put the record straight on his accident, for those of you who follow these things, a lot's been made about drive shafts and brake shafts on Lotus 72s with inboard front brakes. I have to tell you that the accident wasn't to do with that at all. It was a combination of factors. At Monza that year, we ran a hard compound tyre on the left side and a soft compound tyre on the right, and it needed 4 or 5 laps to warm up. He decided to run the car without a rear wing at all in the search for straight line speed. We had the highest top gear that we'd ever fitted in a Cosworth DFV engine car, which is capable of pulling 204 miles an hour. And he hadn't changed the brake balance in the car, which is the means by which you alter the braking effort front to rear. And that's directly proportional to the aerodynamic downforce front and rear. So if you take the rear wing off, you need a lot less brake on the rear. And I think what actually happened was that he went out and tried to put a fast lap together too soon before the hard compound tyres had warmed up. He hit the brakes at the end of the straight. The car had too much braking on the back, and it just slewed, started fishtailing as they do when you've got too much brake on the back. And it speared off towards the Armco barrier. And the Armco barrier, being Monza, was just set in soft sand. It had no anchorage at all. And the wedge-shaped nose of the 72 went under the barrier, and the car swiveled round, and it basically went along the barrier, plucking it out of the sand as it went, until it came to the 10'6" pole on which they'd mounted a loudspeaker, which didn't come out of the ground. And unfortunately, that tore the front of the car off. And another of Jochen's superstitions was that he would never wear crutch straps. So the fact that his legs were trapped in the front of the car and getting pulled this way actually pulled him down through the car. And that's how he suffered his injuries. But I never lose the opportunity of trying to put the record straight on the accident, because there's been an awful lot written about it, and the Italians have gone to great lengths to make everyone believe that it was actually a brake shaft failure. Well, what's his American connection? As I promised you, an American connection with my drivers this evening. He had a shunted Indy too, also in a Lola, but not a Lotus. And one of the reasons why he was a fairly cool customer was he had an exceptionally low heartbeat. And in Indianapolis, they have an absolute hard and fast rule that if you have an accident, it's straight to the medical center to get checked out. Now, Jochen had the throttle stick open in his Lola at 170 miles an hour. And as they do, because they're keen on statistics at Indianapolis, they measured the accident, and I think it came to 800 and something yards before this banana-shaped thing with no wheels on one side came to a rest. Well, they plucked him out of the car and rushed him off to the medical center, and his heart rate had gone up by 2 beats. He won his championship posthumously when Emerson won the US Grand Prix that year at Watkins Glen, which brings me on rather neatly to Emerson. And of course I was very sorry, as all of you will be, to hear that just the other day he had a bit of a shunt in his little aeroplane down in Brazil, but I gather that he's broken a leg, but otherwise that he's in as good shape as can be expected. There's no need to introduce his American connection, although in this case it's come after his period at Lotus, and in fact he's probably better known over here now than he ever was in the UK. He was a real racer at the start of his career, but he had an unfortunate start in the sense that we had all the 1970 season with the Monza business and him having to take on the mantle of being number one and winning his first Grand Prix very soon afterwards. And his second season in 1971 was ruined by a road crash that he had in the middle of it, where he broke his sternum quite badly, and he wasn't really fit again for the rest of that season. But there is a very nice story out that is attached to that road crash. It happened in France, and I was phoned up at the factory and told about it, and in those days the Channel Tunnel wasn't open and aeroplanes didn't fly as quickly as they do or as frequently as they do now. And I didn't know who to turn to, so I phoned up Jabby Crombach, and I said, listen Jabby, you know, Emerson's had this shunt and the place is here, and I don't know if you can help. So Jabby said, don't worry, I'll jump in my car and go straight down there. It wasn't too far from Paris. And he eventually located the hospital that Emerson and his first wife, Maria Elena, had been taken to, and made sure that they were being taken care of. And he thought, well, I'll just go back and try and sort out their luggage and the rest of the stuff at the car. And he opened the front door of the car, and lying in the passenger's footwell were Maria Elena's two front teeth. So he wrapped them up in a piece of tissue and rushed them back to the hospital, and they implanted them back, and you could never tell the difference afterwards. In 1972, I sat down with him, or for 1972, I sat down with him in the Hotel de Ville in Monza, and I signed him for £30,000 for the whole season. And he won us 5 Grand Prix, 4 non-championship Formula One races, and the World Championship. In those days, his English was very poor, and I have to admit that not only I, but Colin and nearly every member of the team decided that we'd have to go probably at least half the season before we really understood what he was talking about. And one of the worst things about it was that he kept on talking about chuckers overs. And every time we're coming to some particularly critical way of setting up the car, he'd keep on coming back to chuckers overs. And it really wasn't until 3/4 of the season that we realized he meant shock absorbers. And to this day, if you listen to him in an interview from his kart IndyCar environment, he still can't say ride height. He says high ride. And that's been with him since 1972. It's very hard to make a true analysis of Emerson in terms of Formula One. He won us the championship. We were very proud of that, very pleased for him. And he had a spirit about him which said, for instance, after he was already on pole position at Silverstone in the days before chicanes and things, and Woodcote Corner was one of the most daunting circuits you could find anywhere in racing, he'd come in and you said, well, there's no need to go out again, you're quickest, I don't think anyone's going to beat you. And he'd say, give me a little more wing and I take it flat. That was good. But then in 1973, Ronnie Peterson joined us, and Ronnie showed quite quickly that actually, ultimately, he was faster. And so it's very difficult to make an analysis of Emerson because we had this terrible contrast of Ronnie being a little bit quicker. But he's a very fine racing driver, and he's had a very long career. And he would always bring, like Jimmy Clark, a sick car home across the line. He was never there when the accident happened. And you could never discount him. If he started from 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th on the grid, he'd always be there at the finish. So a very fine race driver and a very nice experience to have worked with him. Ronnie Peterson's probably my favorite driver for being just pure racing driver. He lived, he breathed, he slept motor racing. And during the year that they were together in 73, we'd start off in practice, and Emerson would go one way on his settings, and Ronnie would go the other way. And 10 minutes before the end of practice, Ronnie would be completely lost. And we'd bolt Emerson's settings on his car quickly, and he'd go out and be half a second quicker than Emerson. So it did present a few problems in the team. He was also so fast and so able that he would drive round problems in the car, which didn't really help us. And there's another very, very frightening and daunting corner called Signe at the end of the very long straight at Paul Ricard in the south of France. And he was complaining about this dreadful problem in the car. And what it amounted to was understeer. And we couldn't understand it because every time we came into the pits and we took the tyre temperatures, the rear tyres were far hotter than the front, which indicated that he had oversteer. So I decided to jump in the car and drive around the circuit and look at him through this very fast corner. Well, it's approached at about 185 miles an hour, and you wouldn't ever, even in qualifying, take it flat, but it's what they call a confidence lift, and then you're back in it. And I went round there, and Ronnie was completely sideways through this corner, doing like 165 miles an hour. So I jumped in the car and drove back to the pits, and I said, "Hey, listen, Ronnie, what's going on? That's not understeer." He said, I said, "That's oversteer. You know, I can see the smoke coming off the rear tyres." He said, no, it's understeer." And I said, "Well, why'd you say that?" He said, "It's understeering so much, I have to throw it sideways to get it round the corner." But the reverse was true of Ronnie. He was always there when the accident happened, in the grid or on the first corner or what have you. But a wonderful, wonderful guy to work with. And his American connection, well, I suppose the nicest story about it was his win at Watkins Glen in the US Grand Prix. Now, in those days, Watkins Glen and the US Grand Prix used to be very special indeed, because it had a $50,000 first prize, which was unlike any other race. And the deal at Team Lotus was that the driver took 45%, and the team took 45%, and the mechanics got 10%. And there used to be this terrible saga in Mal Curry's office in downtown in Watkins Glen, on the Monday morning after the race, where you went in and this guy actually gave you $50,000 in cash. And that was a terribly difficult task to undertake, because the other tradition was that the winning driver bought everybody in Formula One drinks at the Seneca Lodge the night before. So not only did everyone get absolutely blasted, but you hadn't been to bed by the time you fronted up in Mal Curry's office to pick up $50,000. You then rushed to the airport, and I actually paid out the shares in cash on an aeroplane going home. I can't miss out Mario, of course, in my list of drivers that I'd like to tell you a bit about. I can't for the life of me think what the American connection is there with him, but I expect it'll come to me in a minute. What a guy, what a gentleman, what a very great driver. He's also a very successful businessman. He's got an outrageously dry sense of humor, and he's a great ambassador for the sport and for your country. My only regret is that his career was so long and far-flung and varied that we only enjoyed a little bit of him, and that was his sort of Formula One period. I'm sure his record's very well known to you all. Indy champion, world champion. But one of the stories that he tells that I like most is about his very early days, when he was just getting on the bottom rung of the ladder and driving on the dirt tracks on the quarter-mile ovals. And I'm not entirely sure to this day, I'm sure you are, how the system works at those events. But it goes something like you qualify, and then you have to get through another round, and then you get to a heat and a semi, and then you finish up at the back of the grid. I mean, it's very complex. Anyway, there was this young guy. I mean, he couldn't have been more, I suppose, than 18 years old. And he was making quite a name for himself. And he was getting through the pre-qualifying and so forth and into the main event. And the guy who was absolutely king of the show in those days was, I believe, a guy called Branson. Is that the name? Yes, there we are. I've got a yes, yeah. And he used to tell this story. He said, you know, and apparently this guy ran an all-white car, so it was very easy to pick out on the track. And he said, Mario used to say, I can't do his accent, but he has this wonderful drawl, and he said, gee, he said, that guy was so smooth, you didn't even feel it when he put you in the wall. And it turned out that what happened was that as Mario was making progress through the ranks, he was getting more and more up to the king of the sea. And he kept on coming up against this guy, having fought his way through all the qualifying and everything. And he said, every time we get the final, boom, he put me in the wall. And he said, one day I decided I just had enough of this. And we got out in the final, and sure enough, boom, in the wall again. And he said, do you know what I did? He said, I just turned the mother around, he said, and I drove it clear across the infield, and I T-boned him. And he said, do you know what? He never did it to me again. Another legendary bit of Mario was his stamina. When I signed a contract with him in 1976 to drive for us in Formula One, I was very worried about the business of travelling backwards and forwards across the Atlantic, because we'd seen Jackie Stewart get an ulcer from doing that through being over-promoted by Mark McCormack. And it was really a matter of some concern. But he wouldn't have it. He said, no, I'll be fine, I'll be fine. And he used to turn up in Europe, having had an overnight flight, morning of practice, straight down the track, overalls on, in the race car. You wouldn't know he hadn't had a rest for 3 days. Amazing stamina. And long after he stopped racing in Europe, I remember once I got to Rio for the Grand Prix in Brazil, and I was sitting in the hotel and the phone went, and picked up the phone. He said, hi Peter, it's Mario. I said, oh, hi, how are you? He said, listen, I got a favor to ask. So I said, what's that, Mario? He said, well, I got a friend down there. He said, her name's Gabrielle. He said, and I really need a ticket for her to go to the race. So I said, fine, no problem. I'll, get one out. Where can I meet her, etc., etc. Fine, no problem. Well, that year there were 16 Grand Prix. I had 16 calls and had to give away 16 tickets. If he's not already been inducted into your Hall of Fame, he should be, and he should have a room all to himself. Fantastic guy. Nigel Mansell. Now, I'm sorry Nigel can't be with us this evening. He's got this 24-hour flu. It only lasts 24 hours because even the virus can't stand him for longer than that. Now, it's quite well documented that he and I didn't get on too well. But the truth of the matter is that in spite of his public persona, no one in Grand Prix racing got on with him that well. He really was a whinger and a complainer. And he felt that the whole world was against him. And I think we only ever considered that he was well balanced because he had a chip on both shoulders. I like the story very much of the private entrant driver. He drives his own car. And he's up with the leaders for 10 or 12 laps and then falls away. And after the race, his mechanic comes up to him and he says, well, what was up? Did the tires go off? The brakes fade? The engine lose some revs? And the owner says, no, listen, I was knackered. I just couldn't keep up the pace with those professional guys. Now, that's an honest driver for me, and absolutely one for my book. And the problem with Nigel while he was at Lotus was he wasn't honest, either with us or with himself, and there are numerous instances. At Zolder in '81, he was third very early in his career and immediately assumed star status, certainly within his own mind. And he omitted to note that 3/4 of the field had dropped out that day. At Monaco, the next year, he was fourth on the grid and immediately started saying he was a specialist on street circuits. But again, we knew that the reason he was fourth on the grid was that ground effects as such were on their way to being banned, and the sliding skirts were no longer permitted. And we used a material called vethane, and when you came in at the end of a run, you had to go over a block in the scrutineering bay to make sure that your car was still legal. And Colin discovered very quickly, because he was that sort of guy, that if you put over-length skirts on when he went out, by the time he came in, they were rubbed away and they'd still go over the block. So his fourth place on the grid was a blatant cheat. At Rio, when he first got his hands on a turbo car, we were running carbon fiber brakes for the first time. And he had this huge off and came in and blamed it all on the brakes. And as a result of what he told us, we stopped using them and went back to steel brakes, even though they were worth half a second a lap. And that's 30 seconds a race. And after some time, I met Alan Henry, who's quite a well-known and well-respected journalist, and he said, no, that wasn't the case at all. He said he just came blinding into that corner much too fast to ever get round. It wasn't anything to do with the brakes. And Alan Henry was also the guy who said that he reckoned that Mansell needed the slowing down lap after the race to make up the excuse for not winning it. You all know about Monaco when he was leading it in the wet, and the white line caught him out, and he was leaving Prost at 2 seconds a lap when in fact all he had to do was leave him at half a second a lap and he'd have won the race. And there's a very nice tale which I'm afraid takes some explaining, and I'm terribly short of time now, but am I all right? See, I have my little clock here and it's telling me how long I've got to go. In the fabrication shop at the factory, we used to have the Nigel Mansell excuse board. And as you all know, race mechanics and fabricators and people like that working in a team environment are just the most funny people that you've ever had the pleasure of meeting. And this excuse board had the most amazing things written on it. Now, I've got to explain the rest of the story a little bit. About that time, we had a guy in England called Sir Robert Mark, who was the Chief Commissioner of Police for the whole of the country. And I can tell this story because I'm in Accron. He advertised Goodyear tyres. And there was a tremendous fuss about whether it was right and proper for the Chief Commissioner of Police, Sir Robert Mark, to go on television in a commercial advertising a commercial product. And the theme of the advert was Goodyear Eagles, or whatever they were called at the time, the tyre you can trust in conditions you can't. And then he goes on to say, I believe this tyre is a major step forward in road safety. And it was a very well-known advertisement, and all the more so for being controversial. And when we got back from Monaco, after Nigel Mansell had slipped off on the white line, which every other driver had to cross over as well, of course, in the pouring rain, the whole of the Nigel Mansell excuse board in the fabrication shop had been wiped clean, and on it was, Nigel Mansell says, I firmly believe Sir Robert Mark is a liar. So, Nigel, I think he lost 3 world championships and won 1, and I haven't time to go into why he lost them, but one of the small reasons was that he forgot to select first gear on the grid in Mexico. And as someone else said to me at the time, if you're not honest, you might as well keep your mouth shut and just look pretty. Anyway, not to take away from any of his achievements, he was a gritty and courageous race driver. He committed himself heart and soul to something he liked doing, and he did very well. And to his even greater credit, he came over to the kart IndyCar series and did rather well at that as well. So perhaps my view of him, and I did stress earlier on these are all very personal views, perhaps my view is jaundiced by the fact that he's a late developer or something and we had him too early. Now, before I go on to Ayrton Senna, here's an announcement I've been asked to give out. It's for the owner of a car parked outside. It's a yellow and purple Lotus Manager S2 with 2 furry dice hanging from the rear view mirror and a baby on board sign in the rear window. Now, we don't want it moved, we just want the owner to stand up so we can see what the heck he looks like. I first spotted Ayrton Senna in 1982 when, in the most competitive category, Formula Ford 2000, he stood head and shoulders above the other competitors. In October 1983, I had him in my office and he was ready to sign for 84 for $50,000 for the season. But unfortunately, just at that moment in time, the GP of Europe was held at Brands Hatch, which was home territory for our sponsors, John Player, who only made cigarettes for sale in the UK. The ones you buy out of the UK are made by British American Tobacco Corporation. And Elio De Angelis was on pole position in one of our cars. And when we opened the newspapers the next morning, it said Nigel Mansell third as the headline. And so ridiculous were the English editors about the space they would give to English and non-English sportsmen. The guy from Players came to me and said, no, we can't have this Brazilian. You know, we've got to stick with Mansell because he's getting us all the coverage. So I missed Ayrton Senna for $50,000. The following October, he was sitting in my office, and I did sign him, but it cost me $585,000. And the first time he came back to the factory after I signed the contract with him, he couldn't speak. And the complete side of his face was paralyzed. And I thought, oh my God, what have I done here, you know, as this guy? And he can't even smile for the press shots and, you know, the press folders. Well, he had Bell's palsy, and happily, Professor Sid Watkins managed to sort that out for him. And we started working with him in January. But before we went to Rio for testing, he came to the factory and he was all cock-a-hoop because he'd been invited to take part in a race at Nürburgring in standard Mercedes saloon cars. I think there was sort of 2.5 litre 190Es or something, and all the drivers were given the same sort, but he was the new boy on the block. And there was Lauda, and there was everybody who was anybody in racing in this race, and Ayrton won it. And the prize was the car that he'd been driving. So he came to the factory for a seat fitting in this car. And one of the tests that the Team Lotus guys always did with a new driver was to establish fairly early on whether we were likely to have any sense of humor failures, because it isn't all sunshine and roses. So he came into the workshop, and Bob Dance, the chief mechanic, asked him if he'd like to share in our morning cup of tea and our buns. And these were passed round. And at one moment, Bob suggested that the cream was off in the buns. And Ayrton said, "What do you mean the cream's off?" So Bob said, "Well, I think it's bad, you know." So Ayrton, of course, went to smell it, and Bob smashed his face straight in it. And he came up laughing, and so he'd passed the first test. The second test was that when he went out, as all race drivers do, having finished their business, to the smart car in the car park. You know what it is, they're into it, and they start it up and hang 5,000 RPM on it, slip the foot sideways off the clutch, and go out in a blaze of glory. And sure enough, Ayrton was a typical race driver, straight out to his car, opened the door, key in the ignition, loads and loads of revs, dropped the clutch, and nothing happened. He didn't go anywhere. Well, the guys had jacked the back of the car up, so the wheels were spinning in the air. And he passed the second test. Well, about 10 days later, we were down in Rio testing, and he brought his family along and asked if they could sit in the next pit and just watch what was going on. And they were very kind and friendly and helpful, and they brought some food and drinks for us because it was very, very hot down there. And at one particular break, we were having a drink and having a talk, deciding what to do with the car next. And Ayrton came round and he said, hey, oh, you got some drinks. Anyone like some sweets? And he passed these sweets round. I don't know how he managed it, but Bob Dance got the one that turned his mouth blue and made him pee blue for 3 days. So we knew we had a good guy. But the greatest thing about Ayrton, apart from everything else that's been written and said about him, is the effect he had on the team. We felt when he was with us, we were walking on air, and you just knew that if we weren't the fastest car on the grid, there was something wrong with the car. It was never going to be anything wrong with the driver. And that's a tremendous feeling to have, because the guy was magic. And magic was his nickname, invented by a French journalist. And whenever he got another pole position, we all used to wear little buttons which said magic on them. And I think that made him quite proud, because it really was. I remember in Spain one year, he'd been out in practice and he'd set a time which was 1.9 seconds faster than anybody else at Jerez, which is a short and tight and twisty track. And he came in and he didn't get out of the car. And I said, you know, what's up? And he said, well, I just wait here, you know, I'll probably go out again. I said, well, why go out again? You're crazy. No one's going to catch you. That time's out of reach of everybody. And I forget what his time was, but it was something like 1 minute 17.4. And he said, no, leave me. I sit here and think a bit. So he sat in the cockpit with his eyes shut, didn't get out of the car, and he was just focused on something. And then one or two of the other drivers caught him up a little bit, but he was still over a second clear of the rest of the field. And he signaled me over and he said, how many cars on the track? So I said, well, not very many. What are you thinking about? He said, I think I'll go out again. So I said, Ayrton, you're completely silly, you know, there's no point. No one is going to beat. He said, I think I can do a 16.7. So I said, well, okay, fine. I don't know how you work that out, but, you know, it's not necessary. The job's done already. He said, no, I do a 16.7. So I said, well, if you're sure, okay, all right, bolt some new tires on, send him out. He went out and did a 1:16.7. And in the time in between, he'd just been sitting there going mentally through the process of where he had to do this and where he had to do that in order to produce the time. He had this amazing ability to divorce the physical aspects of actually driving the car from the mental things that needed to go on in your head at the same time. And even the Honda people used to say that his memory was as good as their computer recorders, because he could tell them before they could print it out exactly what their engine was doing at any particular point on the circuit. He also had this amazing ability to talk on the radio, and he could be doing a really fast lap and talking to you on the radio, and I've never been able to understand how anybody could do that. And we were testing at Monza one day, and Monza's a place where you can hear the cars all the way around the circuit, so you know where they are, because the sound reverberates somehow off the trees. And he had just come out of the third chicane onto the back straight, and the radio crackled into life. And he said, shit, I'm going to hit something big on the track. And I thought, what's going on? And then you heard this enormous thump through the thing, because the microphone was still open. And a piece of lead that they'd been trying to change the weight distribution on one of the Ligier cars had fallen off into the path of his car, And there he was, just about to have the world's biggest accident. He's on the radio saying, I'm going to hit a great... And you can't believe how a guy can do that sort of thing. Now, going back to Emerson, the first time we ever tried that was for a Texaco commercial that they asked us to do. And it was at Circuit Paul Ricard. And what they wanted to do was have a soundtrack of Emerson talking them round the circuit while they filmed from the car. And this was a very early thing, not the little tiny TV cameras that you have now. When it was over, I went up to the guys who were producing the commercial, and I said, any good? And they said, well, no, not really. So I said, what do you mean, not really? He said, well, the film's very good. He said, but the soundtrack's rubbish. So I said, what do you mean the soundtrack's rubbish? He said, well, come and listen to it. And there was this, when I switched it on, and then the soundtrack went something like this. I'm in first gear. I takes the second gear. I leave the pits. And then it went dum, 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 for about a minute and a half. And then the voice crackled up and said, I come back in the pits. We'll never know, but I think probably with Jimmy, he was the greatest there's ever been. And an American connection for Ayrton? Well, there isn't one really. But I think his stature was such that, like Jimmy, there were very, very few people anywhere in the world who weren't touched by the news of his accident in some way or another. And so he's definitely worth including on my list. I've been going on for far too long, haven't I? I hope you've been able to understand my English. They say that the US and England are two nations divided by a common language. And that reminds me of the American lady who was in Oxford, and she found herself at the wrong college at the university. So she said to the porter, and I can't do this accent either, say, can you tell me where Birkdale College is at? And the porter, being rather stuffy, traditional English university college porter, said, Madam, if you could bring yourself to use the Queen's English and not finish a sentence with a preposition, I might tell you. So she thinks for a moment, and she says, say, can you tell me where Birkdale College is at, you asshole? Now, I've got to finish by thanking you all for your very kind reception and the hospitality and the friendliness. And rather unconventionally, because she had a really tough time of it, I've got 3 little prizes that I'd like to present. Now, during the time I was at Team Lotus, we instituted a system, and I noticed some of you looking at my lapel pin during the day. And it isn't quite like the normal one because it is a proper Team Lotus lapel pin. And they were only made in very limited quantities, and you had to work at Team Lotus for a year before you were entitled to get one. And when I was going through my notes and my desk drawer before I came out here, I found a couple of surplus ones. And I thought that in some small way I'd repay your kindness and hospitality by handing out 3 of them. And the first one I'd like to give is to the guy whose beautiful, beautiful car made the greatest impression on me today, and that's Kevin McGovern, a Team Lotus lapel bag for you. and another exceptionally nice guy who's done an enormous amount to make my trip over very easy, very comfortable, very friendly, and very hospitable, Foster Cooperstein. And finally, the lady in charge, Sandy. But I want a kiss for this. So, I've used up too much time. My clock's broken down. I haven't even mentioned Lotus Cars or Colin Chapman, but perhaps those will come out in any questions you may have. Thank you very much.
I'm sure that if anybody has questions or wants to talk further with Peter, he'll be around. He's going to be around all day tomorrow, and we can probably buy him a drink afterwards now. So, bar's open.